Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. Today I would like to talk about what for me is one of Games Workshop's underrated gems, something from their recent back catalogue of titles which sort of came and went and didn't leave much impact, except in this case it left quite an impact on me, because for me Deathwatch Overkill is Games Workshop game design epitomized, I guess. It really is one of the most cinematic games that they have released. It is the game that most closely adheres to the lore. It's the game that makes Space Marines feel like Space Marines, and it is a game that is a masterpiece in streamlined design. It's a game that plays with so few components beyond the miniatures themselves. It's almost ridiculous. It is almost ostentatious. It is a very, very special game. And I wanted to shine a light on it and show you what it's all about. So first of all, this is a game that some people would probably refer to as a dungeon crawl, in the same way that some people might refer to Space Hulk as a dungeon crawl, but I don't consider it a dungeon crawl. It's a skirmish game. It's a squad-based skirmish game that is set in a dungeon of sorts. The idea is that a team of Deathwatch Marines have descended on a mining colony that has been corrupted by a gene stealer cult. They go down into the mines and they are beset by the cultists, and they have to fight their way through a number of scenarios to destroy the cult and get out with their lives. What makes this particularly exciting is that the game plays out exclusively across gantries that are hanging above a void. So there's nowhere to hide as such. There's no terrain that blocks line of sight. You can see everyone can see you, and the game plays out as a spatial awareness puzzle where it's all about where you position yourself and what range you are from the enemies that want to attack you. It is beautifully cinematic because you have this team of hardened Deathwatch Marines. They all come from different chapters, they all have their own characteristics, their own unique weapons and fighting styles, and they're just packed with character. There's one on a motorbike, so you can imagine this White Scar Marine on a motorbike driving along these gantries above a void, with the gantry swaying backwards and forwards as he mows down the enemy. There are Marines with jump packs that can launch themselves from one gantry to the next as they attack the enemy with their chain swords and their lightning claws. There's stalwart Ultramarines with excellent firepower range. There's a Space Wolf who obviously likes to get up close and knife people. It's got a real Dirty Dozen sort of a vibe to it, where although it's a squad-based game, every member of the squad is a real character. And they're not just characters, they are powerhouses. The Marines are tough. They can mow down loads of gene stealers before they get taken down themselves, and it really does reflect the fact that these are supposed to be the elite. These are the best of the best. These are the guys that go where no one else wants to go and cleans up the mess. And that real cinematic quality, that quality that makes this probably the Games Workshop game that most feels like you're taking part in an action movie, is how streamlined everything is and how few components you have to deal with. We'll quickly look at the components that come in the box and you'll see what I mean. Obviously the game comes with a load of miniatures, and we'll take a look at a few of the miniatures in a moment, but you get 11 Space Marines, and then you get a full Gene Stealer cult, which includes a Primus, a Patriarch, a Magus, and a host of different troop types. Beyond that, you get 8 of these tiles. These are the tiles that you use to create your scenarios, and they represent the gantries that hang above the void in the mining colony, and they're very, very beautiful. They are embossed, so you can clearly see where the different spaces are on the board, and they are very evocative. Very nicely done. You get a handful of stat cards. You get one for each of the Space Marines, and then you get one for the Patriarch, one for the Magus, and one for the Primus for the Gene Stealer forces. The stats for the troop types for the Genestealer forces are just printed in the rules book. You get a small deck of these ambush/gambit cards, which are used by the Genestealer player. I should point out, this is not a cooperative game. It is a game where one person will play as the Genestealer forces, and then one or more players will take on the role of the Space Marines. So it's a competitive game in which the Genestealer player will have access to these cards. These cards will spawn new Genestealers onto the board, and they will also give the Genestealers special tricks that they can play. You get 6 dice, regular d6. This is a game that doesn't mess about with symbols or anything like that. It's all about target numbers rolled on regular d6. Finally, you have the measuring whippy stick, and this is basically the heart of the game. This simple device is what everything else revolves around. Like I say, there is no real terrain in this game. There is no real sense of blocking line of sight. There's no way to duck out of line of sight of an enemy, so all you can do is duck back, and it becomes very much a game of movement and positioning and cat and mouse tactics and kiting enemies, and it's all done with this range ruler. As you can see, it is divided into 3. We have an assault range, a combat range, and then a maximum range. I will show you exactly what that's all about when we talk about the rules. Finally, you get this book. This book has the background information, it has the full rules, and then it has 9 scenarios, and then on the back it has a turn sequence reminder and the profiles for the Genestealer grunts. And that's it. That's everything you get in the box. So effectively, you've got miniatures, you've got the boards, you've got 2 decks of cards, a measuring stick, and some dice. That's everything you need to play this game. I don't think there's another example of a game that requires quite so little in terms of actual components to set up and play. And that's fantastic. And that, for me, is it's what Games Workshop design is all about. I've always said Games Workshop designs are muscular and streamlined. They push as much messy clutter off the table as possible so that you can focus on immersing yourself in the fantastic worlds that they have created. And that's exactly what this game does. Let's take a quick look at some of my favourite miniatures. So these are 2 of my absolute favourites in the set. They both have jump packs. They are incredibly cool. We have a Blood Angel with a chainsword and hand flamer, and then we have a Raven Guard with lightning claws and a classic beaky helmet, making him my favourite for that reason alone. You get this fantastic Salamander Terminator with a humongous flamethrower. You will notice that none of this stuff is painted. That's because I'm a bad hobby man. We have this incredibly cool Imperial Fist with the heavy bolter, and just look at the helmet. We have this fantastic Dark Angel. Beautiful pose, detailing on the sword. Caliban. Nice hood and cloak. Possibly the weakest hero in the game, but I don't care. He looks amazing. We have our Ultramarines captain, because obviously an Ultramarine is at the head of the pack, because Ultramarine. We have this awesome Ultramarine sniper, and yes, there are 2 Ultramarines. There's only 1 of all the rest, but there's 2 Ultramarines because Ultramarine. We have a Blood Raven Librarian with a very big sword. We have our young Space Wolf with a mohawk, combat knife, chain sword. Very fast and very killy up close. Have this guy from the Iron Hands chapter. You can see he's got some mods. And last of all, we have the most ridiculous character in the team. We have this White Scar with the great big saber and the eagle flying along with him on his motorbike, because if you're going to fight enemies above a void on swaying gantries that could break and collapse at any moment, you obviously want to be riding around on a motorbike when you do it. He pretty much sums up what this game is all about. It's ridiculous, over the top. The Marines are going in, all guns blazing. There is no subtlety. They have gone in to shoot anything that moves, and then once it stopped moving, shoot it again just to be sure. The Gene Stealers get this wonderful patriarch figure, which, if you look at the side profile, is doing the curved shape that you see on all the Gene Stealer cult insignias. And also he's got two fingers up to the side of his head, like he's doing a meme. There's the Primus, the Magus with an awesome staff, cute little familiar sticking his tongue out. You get a few pure strain Gene Stealers. If these guys get up close to your Marines, they are one of the few things that can open them up like a can of tuna. There's a bunch of aberrants. Some of them have hammers, some of them have picks. And then you get a selection of hybrids, different generations of hybrids with different weapon loadouts. You get some with auto guns, some with auto pistols and knives. Some have grenade launchers. And there's enough of them to give anybody a bad time. But of course, when it comes to Games Workshop, beautiful miniatures come as standard. Slightly less standard is the actual gameplay, which I think was really pushing the envelope and doing something very different. On the surface, it may look like you're getting Space Hulk. You've got Marines going into an underground complex with, although it's gantries above a void, they're still effectively forming pathways. And then you've got Gene Stealer enemies coming in from spawn points on the edges of the board. But it is a very, very different gaming experience. Very difficult to really put into words quite how interesting this game is. So we're going to talk through how it works, and hopefully I can explain. So it's a scenario-driven game. So at the start of the game, the Gene Stealer player will pick a scenario, they will set up the board, and they will get access to a selection of these ambush/gambit cards, which they will be using through the game. And then the Marine players will select their team. They get told how many they have to select. They will also get told if there are any particular Marines that they have to take. Other than that, they have free reign to take whichever heroes they want. And the game works in a strict turn sequence. First of all, there is a brood mind phase. And in this phase, the Gene Stealer player will draw cards from the ambush and gambit cards. And then they are told how many they have to put down at spawn points as new enemies that can come onto the board at some point. You can see the card is divided into two sections. At the top we have the ambush section, which lists some particular types of enemies. In this case we have two hybrids with autoguns or grenade launchers. Now if the Gene Stealer player decides to play this card as an ambush, they will pick a spawn point on the board. Normally all of the pathways that go off to the edge of the board are spawn points, and they will place that card face down. That card being there lets the Space Marine players know that there is something lurking just off the board, which may at some point jump out and ambush them. However, it is possible to play cards like that as a bluff. For example, if the Gene Stealer player doesn't have the particular type of enemy listed on the card, they can still put the card down. It just means they're never going to spawn an ambush there with that particular card. Cards that the Gene Stealer player does not use for ambushes are kept in hand and can be used for their gambits at certain times. For example, this particular gambit says play this card at any time. Immediately draw 3 extra Broodmind cards, which are these ambush/gambit cards. So you can play this card to gain extra cards to give you better options with when you do your subsequent ambushes and gambit plays. This is possibly one of my biggest complaints with the game, is that these cards are not laid out particularly nicely. They are difficult to parse quickly, and I tend to find that the beginning of the game turns drags a little bit as the Genestealer player has to quickly read through all of these cards, decide which ones to use as ambushes, which ones to use as gambits, when if the cards were laid out in a more standardized format, with the enemies perhaps in bullet points, and this bit here is actually just fluff, which is fine, but it can detract from being able to quickly determine what a card does. So that can slow things down a little bit, but it's not the end of the world. So the Broodmind phase ends when the Genestealer player has placed all the ambush cards that they want to place and have kept back any gambit cards they want to keep for subsequent use. We then go into the second phase of the turn, which is the Deathwatch Commander movement phase, and this is the point where the Marines will move. For this particular example, I have introduced Ortan Cassius, who is the leader of the Deathwatch team. Movement in this game is very simple. It's movement by space, and we can see from the embossed lines on the board. And when you move, you simply move your Marine from the space that they're in to an adjacent space. And when you move to that space, you can position yourself anywhere within the lines of the space as long as you're not overhanging. And if you have allies in that space, you are allowed to move them around and nudge them to make space for your characters going in. However, once your movement phase ends, everyone is locked in place, and that is that. The interesting thing is that if you move into a space with enemies in, you cannot nudge the enemies about. So what you will find happening is that if the enemy knows that you've got a close combat enemy that you want to get into a space with someone, they will position themselves in such a manner that they will prevent you from moving. This will also happen if you need to rush to an exit point or something. You can actually, rather than actually defeating a Space Marine, you can just clog them to such a point that they can't move. For example, if I've got this Genestealer here, and then I've got this Aberrant here, and I've positioned them right in the middle of the space there, poor Cassius can't get into that space because there's nowhere he can stand which isn't overhanging the edge of the space. If these were his own people, he could tell them to budge up, scooch up guys, and then he could join them. But because they're the enemy, it's no go. He's stuck. He cannot get past them. If he's rushing to get to an exit over here, in a turn timer limit or something, he's got to fight his way through. He is bogged down and has to fight. This issue is further compounded if you're actually in the space with an enemy. So, say this guy isn't here. I can now freely move into this space because there's enough room. However, if I then want to move here, I can't, because this Genestealer will stop me. It doesn't matter how many enemies are on the space, if there are enemies there, they grab you, they grapple you to the ground, and you have to fight your way out. The only way to move away is to kill them. And if your opponent can keep putting more bodies into the space, then again, either weight of numbers, attrition, you're going to eventually take wounds and die, or they're just going to hold you up for long enough that you don't get a chance to complete your objective. And I've had some really exciting moments in this game where I've had single Space Marines getting swamped by Genestealers, and then they've been forced to like explode the space and cause massive damage but injure themselves in the process, and then they've tumbled to their deaths off the gantry into the void below. Really cool cinematic stuff. A particularly cool thing about the movement phase is that because we're not in tunnels, we're on gantries above a void, you can actually jump from one gantry to the next. And this is a very simple process. Instead of moving into an adjacent space, you instead decide to make a jump. You measure from your miniature to the space you want to jump to across the void. If the distance is within assault range, then you can jump across. Jumping immediately ends your movement for that turn, but then you also have to roll a dice. You roll, and if you roll a 1, you take a wound that you cannot block with armor, where you fall and land badly, or you nearly don't make it across, or whatever. So there is a risk involved in jumping, but as you can see, by jumping from here to here, you're cutting out a movement from here to here to here and then to here. So you're getting where you need to go much more quickly. The other cool thing is that obviously we have a couple of Marines that have jump packs. If you have a jump pack, you can actually make a jump up to combat range, which is massive, because assault to combat will get you from there all the way over to there. Wow! So that's very exciting. After all of the Deathwatch Marines have moved, then it is the turn of the Genestealer player, and they will do their movement. And all the same rules apply. They can nudge their own units around to make space, but they can't nudge the Space Marines around to make space. And bear in mind, the attacks are all done with this funky range ruler. So all of the movements are being carried out bearing in mind where you need to be in relation to your opponent, who is going to start shooting at you in a moment. And you'll notice the Deathwatch Marines move first. The Genestealers get a chance to react. They get a chance to scurry away. If you've got your heavy bolter suddenly moves out into an open kill corridor and there are loads of Genestealers there, the Genestealer player has one opportunity to book it and clear as many of their forces out of the way as possible before the heavy bolter unleashes hell. So you get these really exciting moments where the Genestealers will part like the Red Sea and they will scurry off into the darkness, and that will force the Space Marines to advance forwards. And sometimes you can actually kite the Space Marines across the board, and what you want to do is you want to kite them as much as possible to get them within range of the ambush cards, because when you flip those ambush cards, you're going to spawn more enemies onto the spaces that are immediately adjacent to the cards, and that's how you can then trap a Marine. If you lure them into a space adjacent to an ambush, you can spawn on that space, you can lock them in, and then they've got to fight out of the grapple, and you can keep bogging them down, and you can keep putting bodies on top of them, and eventually bury them under the weight of your unlimited forces, because the Genestealers will just keep coming. There's nothing you can do about it. They are an endless horde. Once all of the Genestealer models have moved, there is an ambush phase where the Genestealer player has an opportunity to reveal ambush cards and place new units onto the board. Once a card has been revealed and the units have been placed, that card is discarded. If at any point the Broodmind deck runs out, the Genestealer player just reshuffles, so enemies will keep coming. Movement is really interesting, but once the movement is over, that's when things get really fun, because first of all, the Deathwatch commander gets to attack, and you can see here we have the stat card for Cassius. We can see that he has a speed of 2, which means he's going to be moving 2 spaces in his movement turn. He has an armor save of 2+, which means he is very resilient. He can shrug off a lot of attacks. And then he's got a special skill. We'll talk about special skills in a moment. And then he has a number of combat actions. In this case, he has 2 different combat actions. One is using a bolt pistol with Kraken rounds and his Crozius Arcanum at the same time, and one is using his bolt pistol with Hellfire rounds. And you can see that for each of the attack options, there are a number of different squares with numbers in at each of the combat distances, the assault range, the combat range, and the maximum range. And then finally, there's a column that says special, and for the bolt pistol here, it has the special rule Rend, and for the Hellfire rounds here, it has the special rule Blast. For each of your Marines, you're going to pick one of your combat actions. So we're going to see where we are in terms of range with our hybrid here. And we can see, hurrah, we are within assault range of our hybrid. We're going to use the bolt pistol with the Crozius Arcanum. It has 3 squares with 3s inside. That means when we make this attack at this range, we are rolling 3 dice and we are looking to get 3s. I've rolled a 6, a 2, and a 1. So I've actually hit once. Some enemies get an armor save. In the case of these hybrids with the auto pistols and knives, they have an armor save of 6+, so they get to roll a dice. And in this case, he hasn't saved it, so he takes a wound. Most of the grunts will die with a single wound, and that is the case with this hybrid. Bang! Ah! He is gone. And that was pretty effective because I was shooting a weak hybrid, rolling 3 dice needing 3s. But you can see if that hybrid had been at combat range, then I only would have been rolling a single dice needing a 3. And if I had been using my bolt pistol with Hellfire rounds, then I would only be rolling a single dice and I would be needing 5s. Now you may think to yourself, well, why would I ever pick the Hellfire rounds rather than the Crozius and Kraken rounds when I get 1 dice in each case, but the bolt pistol with Hellfire rounds is much less likely to hit. And it all comes down to those special terms. Like with everything else in this game, the weapon system has been streamlined. You're using D6s requiring a target value, and every type of weapon will either have no special skill or it will have one of 3 different special skills: blast, rend, cleave. If you use a blast weapon, rather than targeting a miniature, you target a space. So you would actually target this space here if you wanted to shoot something here. And that means you don't have to measure the range to the model, you only have to measure the range to the space the model is in. Furthermore, your attack will hit every model on that space, friend or foe. So firing a Hellfire round, you may be able to fire it at a space that contains 2 or 3 enemies and potentially kill them all with a single shot. That is why you may choose the Hellfire rounds over the Kraken rounds. Rend is an interesting ability because normally you target a specific model, and no matter how many hits you roll, if you kill that model, that's it, any excess hits are wasted. With the Rend ability, if you have any leftover hits, you can roll those over onto another target in the same space. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons, because it means that you're not wasting any hits, and you may have an opportunity to take out several enemies, but also it means if you target an enemy that's within assault range and get to roll your 3 dice, and you kill that enemy and have hits left over, you can apply other hits to models in the same space that may not have been in assault range. So by picking your targets cleverly and going for the ones that are closest to you, you can actually roll over the excess hits to things that would otherwise be much harder for you to hit. The third special skill is Cleave, and that just means that enemies do not get to make an armor save. And that's it, that's the entirety of the combat system. And then a lot of the characters will have special skills that will modify what can happen in a combat situation. For example, Cassius has Litanies of Hatred, which enables him to reroll 1s for Cassius and any Deathwatch models on his board section. That's not his space, but that's the actual whole board section, when they attack at assault range. And each Marine has unique actions that are available to them and change up what they can do. For example, our Raven Guard has his jump pack, which allows him to jump up to combat range, but furthermore, he can hide in the shadows, so enemies cannot target the Raven Guard if he is at combat range or further. So it's forcing the enemies to get closer to him, which obviously is good for him because he's got some lightning claws, and once they get within range of him, he can pounce and cause some serious damage. There's a really interesting interplay of pushing and pulling the enemies away from you and towards you, funneling them into particular zones so you can hit them with blast weapons, stretching them out so that you can hit them with rend weapons, and then they're also out of position to retaliate. It's really interesting combat system, and there's so much that you can think about, lots of strategy. It doesn't feel like there should be much strategy because there's no line of sight. You can just shoot anything on the board, but it's all about using that range ruler, finding the sweet spot, making sure that you're not grouped together in such a way that a blast target is going to be able to hurt you, kiting your enemies, moving your enemies around the board. It's really cool. Interestingly, the Deathwatch Marines don't have to attack on their attack action. There are other options available to them. One is they can run. So they forego attacking and then they can move into an adjacent space or make a single jump action. The other thing they can do is they can make a combat recovery roll, because the Marines and some of the bigger enemies have more than one wound. And this wound system will be familiar to anybody who has watched my coverage of Space Marine Adventures, because Space Marine Adventures nicked this mechanism. Here's Cassius's card again. We can see he's looking all angry. If Cassius takes a hit, he gets an armor save of 2+, so he will roll his dice, and on 2+, he's okay. But if he fluffs his armor save, he will take a wound, in which case you flip the card over to the wounded side. And if he takes a second wound, he is dead. Now this is really interesting, because being wounded doesn't do anything to your stats. Your stats remain exactly the same. You have the same attack options, you have the same skills, you have the same speed, you have the same armor. Nothing changes except how you suddenly play the game, because the difference between having 2 wounds and being okie dokie and having 1 wound and being 1 hit away from dying is massive. Bear in mind that making a simple jump from here to here requires a dice roll, and if you roll a 1, you take a wound that you cannot block. So if you're wounded, suddenly jumping becomes something you don't really want to do. So rather than doing a quick jump across here, you're going to have to slog it. You're going to have to take the long road round. Suddenly, whereas before you might throw yourself into a melee combat with a whole bunch of enemies, you're a little bit reluctant to do it because 1 hit ends your day. So it's fascinating to see how your ability to play the game changes when you are wounded. Which is why you can actually forego your attack to do a combat recovery. If you do a combat recovery, you don't do anything else other than you flip your card back to your healthy side. It seems like that's something you would want to do as soon as you're wounded, because like I say, being wounded suddenly puts you at so much more risk than you might otherwise have been, and suddenly your gung-ho, I'm a Space Marine and nothing can stop me mentality changes. However, if you give up your attack, you've given up your attack, and remember, the enemy are constantly advancing. They never stop. There's new enemies on the board every turn. There will be ambush cards flipped every turn. Every ambush card that the Genestealer player plays has to spawn, except for one which the Genestealer player can choose to lurk with. Every other ambush card will spawn, so there is a constant stream of stuff coming at you, and you need every attack you can get. And the interesting thing is, the Space Marines attack before the Genestealers. So yeah, you can heal yourself back up, but then you've got to face an onslaught of Genestealer attacks because you weren't using your attack to kill those Genestealers. So the Genestealer that was breathing down your neck that you might have wanted to shoot, instead you heal yourself up, and then that Genestealer is going to have words with you instead, and you may immediately get wounded again. So it really is a hard choice a lot of the time whether to make that attack and try and thin the herd so that you can get a little bit of breathing room and then maybe heal later on, or just take the heal action because you know you're going to take a lot of firepower and 1 lucky hit is the end of the road for you. Good stuff. Really crunchy not in terms of the mechanisms, which are very simple, but in terms of what you want to do on your turn and the decisions you have to make. After the Deathwatch Marines have made all of their attacks or done their run actions or their combat recovery actions, then the Genestealer Cultists will attack. Every model that is within range will do whatever attacks they have available, hit you with hammers, hit you with picks, lob grenades at you, shoot you with auto guns, and just the attacks are so much weaker than the Marines, but it's a slow attrition, and things like the Pure Strain Genestealer are a concern. If the Pure Strain Genestealer gets within assault range, then that Genestealer rolls 3 dice, hitting on 4s, and has cleave, which means it is potential to instantly die under the hands of a single Genestealer. And then after the Genestealers have had their attack phase, this is where it gets really cool. The Marines get a second attack phase. They get another go at mopping up the Genestealers. So every Marine gets another go. They can attack, or they can run, they can take an extra jump, or they can do their combat recovery if they risked it by not doing their combat recovery in their first attack action. And only then does the turn end. Only then do we go back to the Broodmind phase, where the Genestealer gets new ambush cards to lay out, and the whole cycle starts again. It's a really interesting turn sequence where the Marines get so many more actions, so many more opportunities to do things, but they are so outnumbered, and a few lucky hits can really change the way that the game plays out. And that's it. That's all there is to this game. It's a very simple sequence of laying out those ambush cards, moving with the Marines, moving with the Genestealers, attacking with the Marines, attacking with the Genestealers, attacking with the Marines again, and then going back and doing it all over again until the Marines are able to meet their objective for the particular scenario. Obviously, there are little tweaks and twists to that standard sequence of events. Like I say, all of the Space Marines have unique actions available to them, which change up what they can do on their turn and how they act and how they operate. They've all got different attack actions. Some of them are only close combat units. Some of them have decent ranged attacks, but they're not so good up close. The different Genestealer cultists have different weapons. Some of them have special skills. Obviously, once the Patriarch turns up, things can get ugly, and the scenarios themselves throw spanners into the work and make things a little bit more difficult for the Space Marines to deal with. But overall, it's a very streamlined experience. It's a game that you can teach people in minutes, and they will only, once they start playing, start to see how clever things are, like how you use the range system, how you block movement by filling up a space with opponent pieces so that you can't get through, or how you move just a little enemy into a space with a Marine just to grapple them and stop them being able to move, or forcing them to do something out of sequence that they wouldn't normally do. Really very clever, and like I said at the top of this video, I think this is an underrated gem. And I guess really that's all I've got to say. This is not Games Workshop's best game ever, but it's probably the best Games Workshop game you've never played. It's a shame that it's out of production, but I have still seen this on shop shelves in certain places. I don't know how well it's sold, but I think it is, if you can get it at a good price, and you like the look of it, obviously, I think it's something worth checking out. Speaking of checking it out, I'm thinking of doing a playthrough of this on my channel. Obviously, it's not the best game in the world to do as a solo playthrough because it is a competitive game. There is hidden information on the cards, but I would be happy to play through one of the scenarios to show how it all hinges together, to give you a better feel for what it's all about. If that would be of interest to people, please let me know in the comments if that is something you would like to see on the channel. But that is it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. I realise this has been a long video, but if you have liked it, please consider pressing the like button. If you have really liked it, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.